Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Neeru Tandon, Associate Professor, Department of English, VSSD College, Kanpur. We are discussing Paper 3, Literature of the 19th Century, and this module on John Stuart Mill has been written by me. In this module, we are concentrating on two major works by John Stuart Mill. One is What is Poetry? And the second is Subjection of Women, Part 1. Before we discuss these 2 points, let us talk about John Stuart Mill as a person. John Stuart Mill, if I am going to define him in just one word, that is feminist. A man who really felt the problems of the other gender. A man who was there to raise his voice for the cause of women. A man who dedicated his personal and professional life towards the equality of genders. Let's salute him for this noble job. And before going through his works, let us know more about the person. John Stuart Mill was an English philosopher, political economist, feminist, and civil servant. He was an influential contributor to social theory, political theory, and political economy, according to Wikipedia. He was born on May 20th, 1806 in London and died on May 8th in 1873 in France. He was influenced by Aristotle and Plato. His parents, James Mill and Harriet Burrow, were there, and born in 1806, John Stuart Mill was the eldest son of James Mill. A struggling man of letters, James Mill wrote History of British India in 1818, and the work landed him a right position in the East India Company. James Mill spent considerable time educating his son John, who began to learn Greek at the age of 3 and Latin at the age of 8. By the age of 14, John was extremely well versed in Greek and Latin classics. He had studied word history, logic, and mathematics. He had mastered the basic of economic theory. His personality was great, but it was shaped by his father James Mill till date. He had something inherent in his own personality that came later on. In 1851, Mill married Harriet Taylor after 21 years of intimate friendship. Taylor was married when they met and their relationship was close but generally believed to be chaste during the years before her first husband died. Taylor was a brilliant scholar. She was a significant influence on Mill's work and ideas during both friendship and marriage. His relationship with Harriet Taylor reinforced Mill's advocacy of women's rights. He cites her influence in his final version of On Liberty, which was published shortly after her death. Taylor died in 1858 after developing a severe lung congestion only after 7 years of marriage to Mill. Now, Mill, who was considered as the godfather to the philosopher Bertrand Russell. In his views on religion, Mill was an atheist. He died in 1873 in France. He was buried alongside his wife in the cemetery of Saint Verin on the outskirts of Avignon, and his tomb is marked in homage a John Stuart Mill, Defenseur des Femmes, unquote. In 1889, Gladstone referred to Mill as the saint of rationalism. It's very important to go through the obituary of John Stuart Mill because it sums up his character in detail. It was written on 10th May 1873. The Guardian looks back on the life of Mill. The Guardian was a periodical where this obituary was published. I quote, Mr. John Stuart Mill, whose death at Avignon was recorded today, was born in 1805. Those who love to trace the qualities of distinguished men in their immediate ancestry will find their task easy in the present case. James Mill, the father of the subject of our memoir, was not only an historian but a philosopher, and something more than a philosophic historian. It has been said of him that no English writer since Locke has shown so much acuteness in the branch of metaphysics to which his inquiries were devoted. John Stuart Mill, like some other men who have risen to the highest intellectual eminence in our generation, was educated at home. Full stop, unquote. These are just the beginning lines. And after that, a long list goes appreciating John Mill. Perhaps due to in part of his relationship with Harriet Taylor, he advocated the feminist views in such a deep detail. He grounded his views in the empiricism and utilitarianism. He argued that we cannot know the capabilities of women until women are given the same opportunities as men. Now just consider this simple point that he put it so simply, that argued we cannot know the capabilities of women. You are not trusting that they are capable, but when you tried to test them, you have proclaimed that you have no faith in the capabilities of women. And he said, unless and until they are given the right opportunity, the equal opportunity to show their mettle, that judgment cannot be passed. He suggested that it would be for the benefit of the society if women are given the equal opportunity. Biography of John Stuart Mill was written by Nicholas Capaldi, who really justified and expressed in detail his thinking and his point of view without any bias. Some obituaries were written and they were polemical. For example, in Times and in Fraser's magazine, it was published by Hayward in 1873. He not only criticized Mill for his views on the rights of women and land reforms, but also suggested that Mill and Harriet had committed adultery. The obituary was an exercise in character assassination. The publication of his autobiography became an excuse for his critics to be more vituperative. They spoke about the relationship of John and Harriet. They criticized his point of view and never respected what he wrote in his autobiography. But there were positive comments also about John Mill, and they were more in number. I quote some. One who knew Mill only through his writings knew but half of him, and that not the best half, it was said by Stephen. Of course, personality of Mill, his thought process, his views about the humanity, his views about the welfare of human being, especially women folk. The efforts he did as a civil servant about land reform are exemplary. T.H. Green on his deathbed said, "Mill was such a good man." In the same way, it was said by Sidgwick, the best philosophical writer, if not the best philosopher England had produced since Hume, and it was Mill. His philosophical thoughts not only impressed people, they were there to change, to bring a change not in the society only, to bring a change in the thought process of the current society and the people at large. Now, what is the significance of John Stuart Mill still today? Mill's message or messages are remarkable in their breadth as well as their depth. He is a symbol of Victorian integrity, it was said. Now, what makes Mill relevant today? The simple answer is that the practical and intellectual conflicts he tried to resolve are still with us. The humanistic critique of the technological project and the moral theological critique of the modern corruption of the soul are still with us and just as relevant. So, as long as this remains the case, Mill's attempted synthesis remains not only relevant but also logical. Mill was the greatest of the English romantics who expressed what he felt without any bias. He is mainly respected for his views on women's rights. He was called as a feminine philosopher, caricatured by a spy published in Vanity Fair in 1873. This feminine philosopher, Mill, his views of history was that right up until this time, the whole of the female and the great majority of the male sex were simply slaves. He countered arguments to the contrary, arguing that relations between sexes simply amounted to the legal subordination of one sex to the other, which is wrong itself and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement, and that is ought to be replaced by a principle of perfect equality. Now just consider this one simple thing, that subordination of one sex to the other. He was in favor of equality of gender. If he was against the oppression of women, he never meant that women should get that much power that they should start oppressing men. Feminism was not there to be replaced by masculinism. And that is the beauty of writer Mill, who was not writing as if he belongs to one particular sex. He was writing as a human who wanted a perfect unity in the society by balancing both the sexes. We are here discussing two great works by John Stuart Mill, and the first is, what is poetry? When we take it as a question, what is poetry? We can just recognize that since 14th century England, when Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English poetry, started writing poetry without even considering the question, what is poetry? After that, it continues. Writers wrote poetry and the concept of poetry was always under debate. People asked, what is poetry? And the answer is given by John Stuart Mill. He said, poetry is feeling confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude and embodying itself in symbols which are the nearest possible representations of the feeling in the exact shape in which it exists in the poet's mind. Wordsworth had defined poetry that poetry is the emotion, the overflow, and that can be recollected in tranquility. There also that feeling is important. Poetry is not matter of fact or science. Poetry's purpose is to act upon the emotions. Poetry has got no purpose. You know Hardy, when he started writing poetry, but there was nothing to earn out of it. Just for his earning, he started writing novels. Later on, towards the end of his life, he was not satisfied and he had to come back to writing poetry just to satisfy his soul, his craving of an artist. The interest excited by poetry comes from the representation of feeling. What you feel, you want to share with the world. And when you want to share that with the world in a beautiful language, then your sentiments already are out in the form of poetry. Poetry works internally. This is the appeal of poetry. Poetry is never written on a piece of paper. Poetry is always written in your mind, in your heart. Novels work externally. This is the appeal of eloquence. Eloquence is heard, poetry is overheard. Mill says that however the word poetry does import something quite peculiar in its nature, something which may exist in what is called prose as well as in verse, something which does not even require the instrument of words but can speak through those other audible symbols called musical sounds and even through the visible ones which are the language of sculpture, painting and architecture. All this, as we believe, is and must be felt, though perhaps indistinctly, by all upon whom poetry in any of its shapes produces any impression beyond that of tickling the ear. He was of the view that to the mind, poetry is either nothing or it is the better part of all art, whatever, and of real life too. And the distinction between poetry and what is not poetry, whether explained or not, is felt to be fundamental. The object of poetry is to act upon the emotions, and therein this poetry sufficiently distinguished from what Wordsworth affirms to be its logical opposite, namely not prose but matter of fact or science. The one addresses itself to the belief, the other to the feelings. The one does its work by convincing or persuading, the other by moving. The one acts by presenting a proposition to the understanding and the other by offering interesting objects for creation. Now, many of the finest poems are in the form of novels, and in almost all good novels there is true poetry. Then, when we are here to differentiate between novel and poetry, there are poetic novels as well and narrative poetry as well. So, the major point of difference, where does it lie? It is there in the form of feelings and emotions that are natural, that are honest and expressed beautifully. The truth of poetry is to paint the human soul truly. The truth of fiction is to give a true picture of life. That is the difference. The two kinds of knowledge are different and come by different ways, come mostly to different persons. Everybody cannot appreciate poetry. and everybody has not that much of patience to complete the novel. Great poets are often proverbially ignorant of life. Thus, poetry is not in the object itself. If you are writing a poem on a rose, the poetry is not there in the rose. Poetry is there in the truth. And he said that poetry is not in the scientific truth itself, but in the state of mind in which the one and the other may be contemplated. Every poet must go through Mill's narration about poetry. This particular essay tells a lot or makes you feel what the real poetry is. If you want to appreciate a poem, you must know beforehand what constitutes the poetry first. The mere delineation of the dimensions and colors of external objects is not poetry. No more than a geometrical ground plan of St. Peter's or Westminster Abbey's painting. Descriptive poetry consists no doubt in description, but in description of things as they appear, not as they are. Mark the difference, how they appear and how they are. And it paints them not in their bare and natural lineaments, but arranged in the colors and seen through the medium of the imagination, set in action by the feelings. The same object has been seen by many, but through the poet's eyes, when it comes through his pen, then it's a different thing altogether. If a poet is to describe a lion, he will not set about describing him as a naturalist would, nor even as a traveler would, who was intent upon stating the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So, this way, poet is different from a traveler. He will describe him by imagery. Just remember William Blake, how he has narrated. He will describe him by imagery, that is by suggesting the most striking likenesses, contrast between lamb and tiger, which might occur to a mind contemplating the lion in the state of awe, wonder or terror, which the spectacle naturally excites or is on the occasion supposed to excite. All poetry is of the nature of soliloquy. Just one person speaks, and he speaks to himself. It may be said that poetry which is printed on hot pressed paper and sold at a bookseller's shop is a soliloquy in full dress and upon the stage. Poet who was talking to himself, he just gave a dress to that soliloquy in the form of poetry to come to people and in the form of a book. Mill attempts to make a case for perfect equality in the work that is known as the subjection of women. Here in this module, we are dealing with part 1 only, in which Mill attempts to make a case and he talks about the role of women in marriage and how it needed to be changed. Mill comments on 3 major facets of women's lives that he felt are hindering them. What are they? First, society and gender construction. Second, education. And third, marriage. What Simone de Beauvoir said, that a woman is not born, a woman is made. A child, when it comes to know whether a male or female, who tells him or her? Society. What kind of dresses a child is supposed to wear, what kind of language, what kind of feminine and masculine things are do's and don'ts, who tells them? Not nature, but society. And when society tells you, then who shapes the woman? Society. So society and gender construction. Education, yes, your education tells you the rules that he and she, how they are different. And marriage. Marriage, according to Mill, is the one important position that when a woman comes, a whole new world is in front of her. All new do's and don'ts are there to be followed. Her complete life changes. He argued that the oppression of women was one of the few remaining relics from ancient times, a set of prejudices that severely impeded the progress of humanity. Mill's ideas were opposed by many, and people wrote about that also. Subjection of Women, Part 1, and it starts with a title, "The Question Can Be Raised." Now the most important thing is nobody is raising the question against the oppression. Oppression is there, everybody knows. But how many of them has the courage to raise the question? Mill says, the object of this essay is to explain as clearly as I can the reasons for following proposition. The principle that regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes. The legal subordination of one sex to the other is wrong itself and is now one of the chief obstacles to human improvement. And it ought to be replaced by a principle of perfect equality that doesn't allow any power or privilege on one side or disability on the other. It is equally unavailing for me to say those who deny to women any freedom or privilege that is rightly allowed to men are opposing freedom and recommending partiality. Another part of this essay has the title Reason versus Instinct. He compares between the 18th century and the 19th century and says that we have replaced the godlike status of reason by a godlike status for instinct, and we label as instinct anything that we found in ourselves and can't find any rational foundation for that. From the dawn of human society, every woman was in a state of bondage to some or the other man in any role, because she was of value to him and she had less muscular strength than he did. Now just consider this question raised by Mill, that why one gender is subjugating the other. Why she is in the state of bondage? Because it is not because she is valueless. It is because that really she was of the value to him. And whatever is valuable to you, you want to keep it to yourself. You don't want to share it. You are just scared of losing that. And she had less muscular strength naturally, so she was not in the position to defend herself. The next part, titled as Slavery and Absolute Monarchy. Everyone who desires power desires it most over those who are nearest to him, with whom his life is passed. Now just understand this thing. Do we want to control those people who are sitting in other countries? Yeah, we are not concerned with them? No. We want to control those people with whom we want to live our life. The same way, Mill says that with whom he has most concerns in common and in whom any independence of his authority is likely to interfere with his individual preferences. So that is the reason of the slavery and absolute monarchy. Man wants to be absolute monarch and wants woman to be slave because he understands his worth. He understands the worth of the woman in his life. He is the possessor of the power provided by the subjection of women, are better placed than any absolute monarch to prevent any uprising against the system. Every one of the subjects lives under the very eye of one of the masters, in close intimacy with him than with any of her fellow subjects. Now, a very pertinent question that, okay, we all perceive it. It is being done. Is it natural? The subjection of women to men is a universal custom. So any departure from it quite naturally appears unnatural. How beautifully described by Mill. When people in distant parts of the world first learn anything about England, they are astonished. But now it is common. When for the first time you must have heard about the oppression of women, it might have appeared unnatural. But now you listen every day, so it is natural. There comes the last part, that is complaints. Mill is here in favor of raising complaints. He said, it will be said that the rule of men over women differs from all these others in not being a rule of force, that it is accepted voluntarily. Yes, if you ask, so many women will come forward and will say, no, I don't have any complaint. Whatever the man is doing, we are happy with it. Women don't complain, and they are the consenting parties to it. That is the problem. Well, the first point to make is that a great number of women do not accept it. Ever since there have been women able to make their sentiments known by their writings, increasingly many of them have protested against their present social condition. The claim of women to be educated as well and as broadly as men is urged with growing intensity and with a great prospect of success, while the demand for their admission into professions and occupations that have so far been closed to them becomes more urgent every year. There is never any shortage of women who complain of ill usage by their husbands. There would be infinitely more if complaints were not apt to provoke the husbands to repeat and increase the ill usage. That is what frustrates all attempts to maintain the power but protect the woman against its abuses. Raise your voice, woman, raise your voice. That was the dictum, that was the call of Mill. He also talks about affection. Women are in a different position from all other subject classes in this. Their masters require more from them than actual service. If a servant is serving you a food, it's okay. But when a tired woman is serving you, there must be a smile on her face. So they have done everything they could to enslave women's mind. How? Because since beginning, to sum up, I will just raise this question, how the minds of the women were slaved and why. The minds of the women, they were slaved. Because this way they will not complain. They will not have any grudges. They will come forward and accept whatever is being given to them. And once they will have self-control, they will raise their voice, then problems. Problems, who is the oppressor? It is incomplete without discussing one important point. Women should look attractive. Who said so? Who has decided these parameters that woman is attractive only if she is fair or if she is slim or of any such parameters? Who had decided this? A woman? No. It would be a miracle if the objective of being attractive to men had not become the polar star of feminine education and formation of character. From the day one, she is told that she should look good. That is the object. And how and in what circumstances, in what attire she will look good, that had already been decided. She is no one to decide that. And once Men had acquired this great means of influence over the minds of women. An instinct of selfishness made them avail themselves of it to the utmost as a means of keeping women in subjection, by telling them that an essential part of sexual attractiveness is meekness, submissiveness, and delivering all individual will into the hands of a mind. A woman who is meek, acceptable. A woman who is subdued, acceptable. A woman who is raising her voice against problems and oppression is not acceptable by the society. What are the natural differences between the two sexes? It is also discussed by Mill. The need for compulsion, when he says what is supposed to be, is to be discussed. Last question, why marriage? Why marriage is so essential in every society? For procreation? No, that can be done without marriage also. Procreation and marriage, they are all connected because man cannot determine otherwise he fathered whom. A mother has all the points that she can tell, yes, I am the mother. So it is better to keep the woman in subjection. Marriage is needed. And he says that those who try to force women into marriage by closing all other doors against them are open to a similar response. If men are determined to have a despotic law of marriage, they are quite right as a matter of mere policy to leave women no choice about it. To sum up, once again, I will just salute John Stuart Mill as a man who could feel that women's minds are subjugated. They are being trained in such a way that they cannot complain. Their ultimate destiny is marriage and procreation. To raise their voice, they will have to come out first from the chains of the inward mind, and then only they can just ask for their freedom. Thank you. And I feel it is must to go through this book for all men and all women. Keep reading. Thank you for visiting EPG Pathshala.